Hey buddy, Crow here, and in this video I'm going to talk about all 12 games in the Renovation Collection 1. Now you may be looking at me saying, Crow, didn't you already do a video on Renovation Collection 1 for the Evercade? And I'm going to say, no, I didn't. I did 13 videos on Renovation Collection 1. But I did the Renovation Collection 1 completely differently than all the other collections in that every game got its own separate video, and then I made a shorter video with the overview of the thing as a whole, where I ranked the games. I never did any other collection that way, so I'm just going to put together a video with all of that stuff just crammed into one video. I don't care how long it is, this video that you're watching now, and I'm just going to kind of re-edit the opening a little bit. I'm going to do a new thing at the end where I'm ranking the games, and then everything in between is just going to be edited footage from those 13 videos. All of the games in this collection are games that are originally published by Renovation in North America for the Sega Genesis. Renovation Products was actually a division of Telenet Japan that would release their games specifically to North America. If you were to look at the developers of the games in this collection, alongside Telenet, you'd also find games developed by Wolf Team and Riot. But the thing is that those were actually divisions of Telenet at one point or another. Now, even though all 12 of the games in this collection are the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive versions, only 4 of them were titles that were exclusive for that console. 5 of these games were also released for the Sharp X68000, and 3 of them were also released on the TurboGrafx CD. However, only the North American Sega Genesis version of these games were published by Renovation. One last thing I found interesting was that 4 of the games in this collection are part of a game series that had their origins on the NEC PC-88, a Japanese home computer that I knew very little about before I started researching these games. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut to the footage from the 12 videos where I talked about each game, and then after that I'm going to have some new rankings for the games, as well as the cartridge itself.
Arcus Odyssey.
Arcus Odyssey is one of 12 games included in Evercade Cartridge 23 Renovation Collection 1. This is the 4th game in the Arcus series, which was developed by Wolf Team, and it all started in 1988, where the original Arcus title was released for several Japanese computers. Arcus 2, Silent Symphony, and Arcus 3 followed in 1989 and 1991 respectively, and while Arcus 2 was released for almost all the same computers as the original, Arcus 3 was only released for the NEC PC-98. These first 3 games would be remade into one package for Sega's Mega CD in 1993 titled Arcus 1-2-3, which was again a Japanese-only release. Arcus Odyssey was released in 1991 in Japan and North America for the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive, and this is the version of the game that is included in this collection. This game was also released in Japan for the Sharp X68000 and Super Famicom. The Super Famicom version was renamed to Arcus Spirits and was released 2 years later in 1993. Renovation had plans to release the game to the Super Nintendo in North America as well, however the release was cancelled when Sega acquired Renovation. That prototype version of the game was dumped, so the ROM is out there if you can find it. The Arcus in the game's title refers to the land in which the game series takes place. I'm not really familiar with the storylines of the first 3 games, but it's entirely possible that the only thing that links the series together is that they all take place in Arcus. As far as I could tell, the story in Arcus Odyssey doesn't connect in any way to events from previous games in the series. The intro depicts events from 1,000 years ago, where the evil sorceress Castromira attempts to use her dark magic to destroy the world so it can be rebuilt to her liking. Although many tried to stop her, there was only one person powerful enough to stop the sorceress, Princess Lidi. After an intense battle that lasted days, Princess Lidi defeated Castromira and banished her to the Dark World. To prevent her escape, a magical sword known as the Power of Lidi was forged to seal her away forever. This sword had been guarded by the kings of Arcus throughout the centuries. However, the followers of Castromira, the Dark Lords, have now managed to steal the sword and will attempt to free the evil sorceress. It's now up to 4 warriors to take on the journey to defeat the Dark Lords and recover the sword before the seal is broken and prevent the return of Castromira. The previous games in this series have all been turn-based RPGs. However, this game ditches that in favor for a more action RPG approach. The game is actually more heavy on the action than it is on the RPG elements, as you and optionally a second player are basically navigating maze-like levels from an overhead isometric view with the goal of finding the exit. Sometimes just finding the exit is enough, however some levels will require some tasks to be accomplished before the exit can be accessed. There's not really much of an RPG element to this game, aside from collecting usable items that will aid you in your quest, but you can only hold 5 items at a time. Your characters can level up, but it's really only after you defeat bosses that you earn items to increase your power and health. You can manually upgrade your magic with the magic crystals that you've collected, but how much you can upgrade is dependent on your character. There are 4 selectable characters that each have a unique attack method, magical abilities, and different levels of health, requiring different skill levels to master. There's Jeddah, the sword-fighting knight with the vacuum wave sword technique. Aaron, the chainsword-wielding warrior. Diana, the bow and arrow user that can fire arrows that bounce off of walls. And Bede, the magic-using scholar who primarily attacks with fireballs. Each character's abilities can extend further than that, but that's how they start out. Along the way, you'll encounter some NPC characters that'll help you out, and some will actually join you temporarily in your quest if you can find them. Now, I've known about this game, but I never played it before, and I always figured that this game was some sort of RPG, but it's not really what I thought it was. It's definitely more action-based than I thought, as I ran around the game's levels, constantly hammering away on the fire button because it was a good way to eliminate monsters before they could attack. The only downside to this is if dialogue starts appearing, you'll accidentally forward through it before you can read it. If you're thinking of using a controller with turbo fire with the Evercade VS for attacking, it might not work out so well since you have to hold down the attack button in order to shield yourself from attacks, and I kind of found that a bit weird, so part of the game's challenge is knowing when to dodge and block attacks. The in-game menu has an unusual control scheme as well. A button is used to open the menu, and then the same button is used to select an item, and then a different button is used to close the menu. But then the same button used to close the menu is also the same one you would press to use items and magic. It felt kinda weird and it took me a while to get used to. You only get 1 life, and if you die, the game does allow you to continue, but all the way at the start of level, which can be a bit of a setback. But on the plus side, you can continue as many times as you want. Despite a few negatives, I did like the game, and it does offer a bit of replayability with multiple unique characters, and you may also discover previously missed items and events in subsequent playthroughs. Beast Wrestler! Beast Wrestler is one of 12 games included in Evercade cartridge number 23, Renovation Collection 1. Beast Wrestler was developed by Riot for the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive in 1991. Riot also published a game in Japan, but Renovation published a game in North America, and it appears that the game was released in North America nearly 2 months before the Japanese release, which I find a bit strange seeing as how it's usually the other way around for Japanese developed games at the time. The premise behind the game is that scientists have developed a way to create giant dragons, and I guess they couldn't think of what to do with them except have them wrestle each other. So around the year 2015, the Dragon Warriors Committee was formed, and people could start owning these genetically altered dragons and train them to participate in the Dragon Warrior games. These games are just pretty much wrestling matches with giant beasts. It's now the year 2020, and you enter the games as a rookie with a newly created, inexperienced dragon with the ultimate goal of developing him into a world champion. Now there are 2 main game modes, and the story described refers to the tournament mode. The other option is match mode, and it's really just a single match play where you could choose from a roster of 10 beasts and play against the CPU or a second player. However, tournament mode is much more interesting despite only being for 1 player. As you begin, you're given a beast to start out with, but you don't get to choose the beast, but you do get to name him and choose one of 2 special moves for him to perform during matches. From there, you'll proceed from match to match facing increasingly more powerful opponents, but in between every few matches, you'll get to visit a shop where you can spend your winnings on items that will mostly help with your beast training, such as increasing its speed, power, or health. And if that was it, I'd say that's kind of a cool idea on its own, but there's a bit more to it. Twice during your rise to the top, your beast will grow too worn out from all the battles, and you'll get the chance to merge him with another beast, creating a brand new beast for you to continue the tournament with. In this way, the game gives a good incentive to replay the tournament multiple times just to see what type of creatures you can end up with. The wrestling matches themselves are pretty typical for wrestling games at the time, with one button for punches and holds, another for tail whips and slams, and a dedicated button for special attacks. These special attacks are otherwise known as death blows and can only be performed when indicated on screen. The only thing about this game that differs from a regular wrestling match is that you can't pin your opponent. Rather, if a beast cries in pain 3 times, the match is lost. If the match time runs out, a winner is chosen by decision. Now, I've never played this game before, but I've certainly heard about it. I always got the impression that this game may be in the so bad it's good category, so I was looking forward to trying this one out. Well, after playing it, I can definitely say it doesn't play that great at all. It's a wrestling game, so it's all about the grabs, punches, and tail whips, but the animations and hit detection are terrible. If 2 beasts are standing right next to each other, it's possible for every attack to go through the other beast and completely miss. That's because for the attack to make contact, the very end of the appendage used has to make actual contact with the opponent's sprite. If a beast is lower on the screen and throws a punch and the fist appears overlaid over the bottom of the opponent's sprite, it counts as a hit, even though it doesn't make any sense perspective-wise. There are a few beasts that crawl, and even though they're low to the ground, you can still hit them with a standing punch if you're lower on the screen. And other times it could look like you're making contact with the opponent, but failing to hit them completely. It can be incredibly fiddly to figure out where you need to be standing to make contact with the opponent. Also, it's kind of annoying when a monster falls down because it can seemingly take forever for him to stand back up. Normally, a standing beast can still attack a downed creature or even pick them back up, but if that creature screams in pain, nobody can really do anything until the game decides you can. It's the same thing during grab attacks. Everyone just has to wait until the animation decides to finish. It's a shame that the actual wrestling portion of this game is so bad, because for a little while I thought I could get to like this game, because it certainly has some charm to it, especially with the insane amount of misspellings found within the game. So yeah, ultimately I didn't find this one so much fun to play. And it's a shame because I really enjoyed the concept of training and evolving your dragon through the ranks, although that portion could have been done a bit better as well. Like, why can't I visit the shop and train my dragon in between every match? Dino Land! Dino Land is one of 12 games included in Evercade cartridge number 23, Renovation Collection 1. Dino Land was developed by Wolf Team and released in January of 1991 for the Sega Genesis in North America, and this is the version of the game included in this collection for the Evercade. The game was also released in August of 1991 for the Sega Mega Drive in Japan, and finally in November of 1991 for the Sharp X68000 in Japan. The Japan versions of the game were called Shotaru Retsuden Dino Land. The Genesis and Mega Drive versions are virtually the same, but the Sharp 68000 version, while looking very similar, plays quite differently. It also seems to have more speech samples, but looks to be missing some of the animations of the other versions. The premise of the game is pretty straightforward. You're a small dinosaur named Dino Buns, and he has the ability to curl up into a ball which makes him deadly to other dinosaurs. When your girlfriend, Michelle, gets kidnapped, you'll have to rescue her, and this is something that occurs quite regularly throughout the game. And that's about the long and short of it. Well, you wouldn't know it from the game's title or box art, but this is a pinball game. There are 3 levels, Earth, Air, and Water, but you'll be spending most of the game on the Earth level for reasons I'll explain later. The game features your typical gamepad pinball controls for the time of release, except during the boss fights. Things will play out like usual, and the goal will be to hit the boss enough times to make him retreat. However, there's another little critter that circles the playfield attempting to kidnap your girlfriend. In order to stop him, you'll have to hit a button to transform into a dinosaur, and then touch that little critter to make him turn around and head in the other direction. The catch is there's a time limit as to how long you can walk around before you're forced back into a ball. There's a meter that drains while you're in dinosaur form, and it refills back up when you're in ball form. You'll have to time your transformations until you're close to that little guy, because if you let the meter run out and you're forced back into a ball, by the time you can transform again, it may be too late. The game seems promising at first. It certainly is playable, and I never really had an issue getting the ball to where I needed it to go. However, the first thing I noticed is that the game doesn't exactly scroll smoothly up and down the playfield, and everything's not really well animated, but it's something I got used to over time. The game's main problem is that there's very little to do on each playfield, and you'll be shooting the same things over and over again. You'll be on the Earth playfield most of the time, and all there really is to do there is shoot the slot machine, the T-Rex's mouth, and the hole in the middle of the screen. Hitting that hole enough times will gain you access to the boss, and if you succeed in beating him, you'll get a massive 1 million points. So you'll just be wanting to do that over and over and over again if you're going for a high score. The only thing I thought was clever was that after meeting a certain criteria on that playfield, lightning will strike, causing your friends to appear in the middle of the table, and by passing them over, you'll get a chain of balls to follow you, and all of your points will be multiplied by the number of balls in play. However, this will also summon the ball eater to the playfield, and if you hit him, you'll lose a ball in the chain. He will not leave until the entire chain is gone. As for the additional playfields, there is a sky and a sea level, and there are 2 ways to access them. By meeting certain criteria, the path to the sea or sky will open as indicated on the screen below the flippers, and access is made by draining the ball, which I found to be very bizarre. In fact, I was reluctant to do it the first time I saw it because it goes against my natural instinct. It also seems to take forever for these areas to open up. I have no idea what the criteria is, but it doesn't seem to happen very often. I've gained access more frequently with the second method, which is just to get 3 matching birds or sea creatures using the slot machine at the top of the playfield, which will instantly teleport you to these areas. But that can still take a while to happen. Each area plays basically the same way, and each has its own boss that can be fought. These other boss fights are slightly different, but they're basically the same thing. Keep hitting the boss until he goes away while keeping the little guy away from Michelle. Access to the boss is even the same in the sea level as in the earth level, but for some reason the sky level has a different method. The sky level also has a couple of extra unique features, like a breakable egg that releases a random airborne creature, and if you hit it before it leaves the screen you get extra points. But it makes me wonder why the sea level is so similar to the earth level, while the air level is significantly different. Regardless, the sea and the air level are also more difficult than the earth level, so odds are you'll be sent back to the earth level when you lose the ball before you know it. The game gets to be quite repetitive and boring after a while, so imagine my surprise when I found out the game has an ending that is accessed by maxing out the game score. Now, you don't have to do it all in one game. After your game is over, you can select Continue, and the next game starts with the score you had when the last game ended. And I believe you could just keep continuing indefinitely. Even then, I can't see most people playing until the end because it took me almost 4 hours to do it, and I only did it out of curiosity because I'd stopped having fun with the game long before I maxed out the score. While I feel I've had enough of this game to last me 10 lifetimes, I can't really say I don't like it, but I certainly can't say I do like it either. Maybe if the air and sea playfields weren't so inaccessible and difficult, the game would feel like it has more variety.
El Viento.
El Viento is one of 12 games included in Evercade Cartridge 23, Renovation Collection 1. El Viento was only released for the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive in 1991 and is the first in a trilogy of games. The second game in the series was Ernest Evans, which was also released for the Genesis/Mega Drive, but Japan also received a version for the Sega Mega CD as well. Annette Fudutabi is the final game in the series, and it was only released in Japan for the Sega Mega CD. Before I researched these games, I was already aware of El Viento and Ernest Evans, but I had no idea these games were related.
Oh, ugh. If you're into the high-tech and high-intrigue action of 16-bit gameplay's hottest cart, you know I'm talking about El Viento for the Genesis. What you may not know is that El Viento means the wind, and that pretty well describes the fast action as our hero fights the mobsters of Chicago in the 1920s. Whoa!
Well, that clip was from a 1992 episode of GamePro TV, and Mr. J.D. Roth got most of the details about the game correct, though it is an oversimplification of the plot. The game does take place in the 1920s, 1928 to be specific, and you do fight mobsters, only in New York, not Chicago like he said. The main antagonist ultimately is the Hastur group, who are planning a sacrifice ceremony in the still under construction Empire State Building. This sacrifice is meant to summon Hastur, a powerful deity that will destroy modern civilization. The only one that can stop them is Annette, a young sorceress with a blood relationship with Hastur. It is through this relationship that Annette has mastered the power of wind. However, it will not be easy for Annette to stop the Hastur group, as they have many allies, including the largest mob in New York. El Viento is a run-and-gun platformer of sorts, as you control Annette as she runs through the levels attacking enemies with a boomerang, her main method of attack. Annette also possesses various magical abilities which are slowly unlocked throughout the game. As you would expect, the more powerful the magic, the more magic points that are consumed. The magic used is selected by how long you hold down the magic button. Magic points are automatically replenished, so you really aren't limited to the amount of magic you can use, just how frequently you can use it. Annette only has one life, so if your health bar is completely depleted, it's game over. The trade-off is that the health bar will increase in size as enemies are eliminated, and most enemies won't cause too much damage if Annette gets hit. And that means that Annette can take a lot of punishment before dying. If you do get a game over, you can't continue from the start of the last stage you were on, but you only get 3 continues before you're forced to start the game from the very beginning. Personally, I think this game is incredibly fun. It looked like it would have been back when I saw it on GamePro TV, and now that I've actually played it, I can say that it definitely is. The game is fast-paced, the boomerang is fun for a main attack, and you've got magical abilities that can change things up. You don't even have to worry about conserving magic, since the MP meter recharges fairly quickly. I also appreciate that Annette can take a ton of damage before actually dying. The game can get quite difficult regardless, and I was stuck on some bosses for some time before I was actually able to beat them. I mean, even the first boss has 3 forms. But even then I wouldn't count that as a negative necessarily. The only thing that really annoyed me were the bats in the last level. There were just way too many of them, and they just kept popping up constantly to the point where they were slowing down the game. I think they should have eased up a bit on the bats, especially since that level was sort of a maze to begin with. This is the game I was most looking forward to playing in Renovation Collection 1, and I have to say I was not let down. Exile! Exile is one of 12 games included in Evercade Cartridge 23, Renovation Collection 1. The evolution of the game series is actually quite interesting. The series starts with Exile, which was released in 1988 for the MSX, NEC PC-88, PC-98, and the Sharp X1, only in Japan. Exile 2 was the second game and was released later that same year for these same platforms, again in Japan only. Exile is the next game, and it's actually a remake of Exile 2. It was released 3 years later for the Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx CD, and was the first game in the series to be released in North America. The Sega Genesis version of the game is the one included in this collection. The final game in the series was Exile: Wicked Phenomenon, and it was only released for the TurboGrafx CD. Now, Exile is a remake of Exile 2. However, there was a significant portion of the game's story removed and alterations in some of the events that happened during the game. Also, the XZR games referred to real people and places grounding the story in modern history, but Exile renames all of that to make the game more fantasy-based. The renaming also extends to healing items, as in XDR they were all based on real drugs, whereas those references were removed in Exile. There are additional differences between the Genesis and TurboGrafx CD versions of the game, aside from the CD enhanced features, as the Genesis version censors and removes certain scenes revolving around graphic violence and nudity. I could keep going on and on about the differences in all these games for a while, but instead I'll direct you to 2 videos from the YouTube channel Basement Brothers that go into a lot of those details if you're interested. They are fantastic videos. Now, the story of the Exile series focuses on a character named Sadler, a desert warrior and his adventures, which usually have him traveling to distant lands and sometimes through time. Since Exile is a remake of Exile 2, it picks up right after the events of Exile, which could be a bit confusing if you didn't realize it, because the game doesn't really introduce us to the characters from the first game, and it just kind of assumes we know who they are. The main plot of this game involves Sadler accepting a mission to find an artifact called the Holomax, which supposedly has the ability to unite all mankind, which in turn would eliminate war as a whole. Exile is an action RPG that is broken out into 3 basic gameplay sections. There's the RPG element, presented in an overhead view where you and your companions walk around, talk to people, and buy equipment and supplies. And I should note that you only really need to worry about the equipment and items for your main character, Sadler, as your companions change out often and they never help you fight. They are there for story purposes only. Then there are action sequences which play out in a side-scrolling platforming style, and lastly there's a map screen where you can choose the next location you'd like to visit. As soon as you leave a location, the map shows up and you simply select your next location and you're instantly there. For an action RPG, this game is pretty linear and short. It's also incredibly easy if you grind up levels early in the game. Sadler's max level is 17, and that might tell you something about how short this game is. The action sequences in this game aren't exactly refined. The characters are so big that often they'd appear on the screen and I'd get hit before I could even react. Sometimes I'd enter a room just to spawn right on top of an enemy. The hitboxes are also crazy, as I've noticed instances where an enemy's attack would completely miss me visually, but I'd somehow get hit anyway. The few magical abilities Sadler has are all used pretty strangely. If it's an offensive magic, it'll be applied to your sword, so every time you attack you'll be spending magic points until you remove it. The RPG element of this game isn't that great either. Like I said, it's all pretty linear. Somebody will always tell you exactly where you need to go. There's never more than 2 or 3 location options at any one time, and there's really no side quests, well, aside from obtaining the Void Sword, which just involves going through one of the dungeons again immediately after you just went through it. There aren't a whole lot of items or equipment to purchase throughout the game, but nearly everything is so cryptically named, and the game never tells you what any of the items actually do, so you have to look that information up in the game's original manual or somewhere else online. It seems like that's information that Blaze should have put in the manual for this collection. I mean, they gave this game 2 pages in the manual, but most of it is devoid of actual information. One bit of information I couldn't find anywhere, though, was how to open the chests I encountered during the action levels. I couldn't figure it out. I tried walking over it, attacking it, I tried accessing it through the menus, I tried pushing down while I was standing over it and then trying that with a button, and nothing was working, and not even the game's original manual said specifically how to open a chest. I went through most of the game before I realized that you had to push up while standing over a chest to open it. Is it just me? Is it supposed to be that obvious? It seems really counterintuitive to me. Overall, I can't say that I like the game, but there's something about it that prevents me from disliking it as well. Final Zone! Final Zone is one of 12 games included in Evercade Cartridge 23, Renovation Collection 1. The Final Zone series started in 1986 with the title Final Zone Wolf, which was released for the MSX, NEC PC-88, and Sharp X1 in Japan only. It was followed by 1990's FZ Senki Axis, which was released for the Sega Mega Drive and Sharp X68000. This game did receive a North American release for the Sega Genesis under the title Final Zone, and this is the game included in this collection. The final game, Final Zone 2 also was released in 1990 and was released for the PC Engine CD in Japan and also received a North American release for the TurboGrafx CD. 100 years in the future, weapons of mass destruction have been banned from being used in war. The fighting is now done in power armor called New Age Power Suits, or NAPS for short. It's up to Howie Bowie, the leader of the military unit Team Undead, to infiltrate the enemy territory and destroy the last weapon of mass destruction. Now, if you've only played the game and never read the manual, you'll have no idea what the plot is because none of that information is mentioned in the game at all. The game is primarily an action-focused, isometric view-based shooter where you control Howie Bowie's NAP, completing each level's objectives in order to move on to the next level. Levels usually start out with a set of mission objectives, which is usually to hunt down and destroy a certain number of each type of enemy over a vast area. Once completed, you'll be thrown into a boss fight. Defeat the boss and then proceed to the next level to do it all again. It all sounds pretty straightforward so far, but the gameplay mechanics of your power suit are a bit unconventional. You have a main shot and an optional shot. If you're holding down your main shot button, your suit will continue to fire in that direction until the button is released. There are 20 different weapons in the game that you can collect, and you can carry 14 weapons at a time. However, some of those could be duplicates, and you can only really use 2 weapons at a time during the game. During gameplay, you can enter the weapon select mode and swap those weapons around any way you like. On this screen, the order your weapons are listed is very important. The weapon at the top of the list will have unlimited ammo and will be your main attack weapon. The second weapon on the list will be your optional weapon, and it will have a limited amount of ammo, and it'll also behave differently than if it was set as your main weapon, as it'll have a more powerful attack than if it was assigned as your main weapon. The rest of the weapons on the list are just there to act as shields, but the order they are listed is still important. When you get hit by enemy fire, you'll lose the weapon on the bottom of the list, and if you keep getting hit, you'll lose each weapon one at a time until your main weapon is eliminated, and then when that happens, it's game over. However, you can continue a limited amount of times. To make things more challenging, your shields, aka your weapons list, does not regenerate between levels, and you'll have to find and destroy enemy transporters in order to replenish your weapons and shields. When I first started playing this game, I really didn't like it. Many of the animations were not very fluid, as well as some of the enemy motions as they traveled across the screen, and that made the game seem very stuttery. It also doesn't take much screen action to completely tank the game's frame rate. The missions where you have to find and destroy different types of enemies can be pretty tedious because you'll have no idea where they are, since you'll have no overhead map of the enemy or a scanner or anything. And since all the sprites are pretty big, you're not really given a big view of your immediate surroundings. You'll just have to randomly keep searching until you find what you need to destroy. Each of these game sections is also populated by these little drones that mostly don't do anything but get in your way, although they will get more aggressive when the number of targets is reduced to 5 or less. However, I have to admit that as I continued playing, something snapped and I started understanding how to approach the game, and I started surviving much longer, and I actually did like experimenting with all the weapons. I mean, you do get a vast array of weapons, and since they behave differently as main and optional weapons, it's kind of like doubling the variety of weapons you have. However, I still will not go as far as to say I actually like the game. Gaiares. Gaiares is one of 12 games included in Evercade Cartridge 23, Renovation Collection 1. The game was developed by Nippon Telenet and released in Japan near the end of 1990. In early 1991, it was published in North America by Renovation. This game is exclusive to the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive. In the year 3008, the Earth is pretty much devoid of all life due to environmental destruction, radioactivity, and pollution. The human race has been forced to live off-planet in space colonies and is facing extinction. An intergalactic terrorist group is currently planning to invade Earth and use all of the polluted waste to build weapons of mass destruction. Oh, and the leader of this group has got to have one of the greatest names for an antagonist ever conceived. Her name is ZZ Bad Nasty. However, the game manual says her name is ZZ Bad Nasty, which is what I think it was supposed to be, but in the game she's referred to every time as ZZ Bad Nusty, so that's gonna be her name. To quickly sum up the rest of the story, to prevent Bad Nusty from succeeding, the United Star Cluster of Lizaluth is willing to supernova Earth's sun and destroy the Earth if the remaining humans can't stop her. Alexis from Lizaluth wants to help return the Earth to its former beauty, so she delivers the TOES system to Dan Dare, Earth's last hope at countering the terrorist organization. So having described the story, I can explain why the game is called Gaiares. Gaiares is actually two words combined. The first is Gaia, a word that represents the personification of the Earth. The second is res, which doesn't seem like a word until you realize that there's no L sound in Japanese, and English words with L sounds are often spoken like R's in Japanese. So, replace the R with an L and you get less. Well, you gotta add an extra S in there, I suppose, but in the end, you get Gaia-less. Or in other words, Earthless, which is what the human race is in the game's story. The game is a horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-up with a unique power-up system. As you maneuver your ship, a device called the TOES, it's T-O-Z, I could never figure out what that actually stood for. Well, anyway, it hovers nearby, offering additional firepower. However, the TOES can be sent out and attached to enemy ships, and after a few moments of being attached, it will return, giving you the weapons of the enemy ship. Different enemies will provide different weapons, so to switch weapons, you'll have to attach the TOES to another ship equipped with a different weapon. You can also retrieve the same weapon multiple times to power it up. However, there are some ships you cannot steal weapons from, and that includes the level's bosses. You can also use the TOES to retrieve defensive items floating around in space as well, such as a shield or a device that instantly clears the screen of enemies. The thing to be aware of though is that if you send the TOES ahead, you cannot fire again until it returns. You're also in control of the ship's movement speed, as there's a button to cycle through 3 speed settings, and that'll be needed in some areas of the game, as you might want to slow down to navigate tight corridors or speed up to avoid some of the faster attacks. Your ship can take multiple hits before being destroyed, and if you run out of lives, you're given a limited amount of continues before being forced to start from the beginning. This was a game that I was always aware of, but I never played it in the past. I'll never forget those Gaiares ads that would always appear in video game magazines I used to read. So the game actually seemed pretty hyped up back then, especially being one of the first 8 megabit Genesis game cartridges. And after playing it, I thought the game itself was a pretty fun shoot-'em-up, although it could be difficult in some parts. But it's helped that your ship can actually take a few hits before it's destroyed. The game's graphics, audio, and visual effects are pretty nice as well, but I really like the large creative bosses in this game, which are all giant mechanized versions of things like mermaids and dragons, and even a female warrior with a shield and sword. And so as I've said, the game can be difficult, but it's also a blast to play. The game was also rated pretty highly when it was released, and I think I've got to agree with that consensus.
Granada.
Granada is one of 12 games included in Evercade cartridge 23, Renovation Collection 1. Granada was developed by Wolf Team originally for the Japanese Sharp X68000 in 1990, and then was released for the Sega Mega Drive later that same year. 1 month after the Sega Mega Drive release, the game was brought over to the Sega Genesis in North America by Renovation. There were no other ports for this game. So the game's story. Well, I've tried to figure it out from multiple sources, such as the game's original manual, the Evercade manual, and whatever else I could piece together from online sources. And the least helpful source in trying to nail down the story is the game itself, which only has an opening text scroll that starts with Granada. Nobody knows who named it. What? Who named it is probably the least important thing to know. What we do know is that Granada is a hypertech cannon tank, or HCT, being piloted by Leon Todo. While in Japan, Leon was contacted by an agent of the Private Enterprises Intelligence Department, or PEID, who gave him a floppy disk containing a job request. Shortly afterwards, the agent mysteriously turns up dead. So Leon accepts the job. But we're never actually told what that is. All we know is that Leon winds up in Tabora, an actual place in Africa. While there, he finds the Granada. but there's nobody from the PEID around, which is pretty suspicious. From that point, we can only assume that that scenario leads into the game where you control the Granada, destroying other HCTs regardless of who they belong to. But why is Leon doing this? I can't find any explanation for Leon's actions after he finds the Granada. It's like there's this whole huge plot element that's completely missing. And if you only follow the plot the game gives you, all you'll know is that nobody knows who named the Granada. It destroys all weapons it encounters, and only those who have actually happened to have seen it know the truth. Well, perhaps they should have gotten one of those people to tell the story. Seeing as how this game is influenced by various arcade games from the time, the focus is more on gameplay than it is the plot anyway. You get an overhead view of the action as you pilot the super tank as you hunt down and destroy the enemy. Each major HCT is marked on a mini-map, making it fairly easy to hunt them down as they are your primary targets. Once all the HCTs are eliminated, the boss of the level will then appear. You'll have to destroy all the HCTs as well as the boss within the allotted time limit in order to proceed to the next stage. Your tank can move in 8 directions, and it will fire rapid shots in the direction it is facing, including the frames shown as the tank is turning, so you can actually fire in 16 directions. There is a button that allows you to lock the direction the tank is facing, and this will allow you to fire in the same direction while still maneuvering the tank freely. You can also fire a super powerful shot, but the drawback is that the tank will recoil in the opposite direction the shot is made. You can use this to your advantage to quickly dodge enemy fire, but it must be used carefully if you're on an elevated stage because the recoil could potentially knock you off a ledge, causing you to lose a life. You can also lose a life if the timer runs out or if all the tank's health is depleted. But I don't believe there's any way to replenish the tank's health. However, there are support units that can be encountered throughout the game that can help you out, such as the reflectors, which will hover around Granada and fire its own bullets, a disc-like object that can attach to Granada and deflect bullets and also be deployed to fire multi-directional bullets before returning, and also an item that will cause a massive blast, destroying all enemies within the blast radius. I thought Granada was a pretty fun game to play overall. It takes a little time to get used to locking your tank in the direction you want to fire, but I eventually got used to it, though it can be a bit of a pain sometimes because you can't just change directions instantly, as you have to allow time for the tank to rotate in the right direction before locking it down. This means that sometimes you'll be maneuvering the tank in directions you really don't want to go just because you want to fire in that direction. I was playing this primarily on the Evercade VS using an arcade controller, and it's something I would highly recommend for this game as I found it's more comfortable than a gamepad since you'll be holding down multiple buttons for an extended period so you can lock the gun and provide constant fire. I tried to play this with the standard Evercade gamepad one time because I was too lazy to go get the arcade controller, but that was so uncomfortable that I had to switch to the arcade controller anyway. The game itself was a lot longer than I was expecting it to be. There are 9 very unique levels, each with its own distinct boss. The game starts to get brutally difficult about halfway through though, and after level 5 I kept thinking that this has got to be the last level, and then shocked when the game just kept going. Now I know the plot isn't really that important in a game like this, but the game's manual really tries to build up the story and makes us wonder what's going on with the PEID. But really, Granada was not at all what I was expecting from a game where you control the tank. It plays a lot faster than I thought it would, but it's also much longer and difficult than I was expecting as well. But the story is so bad and confusing they probably would have been better off without one. Sol-Deace. Sol-Deace is one of 12 games included in Evercade Cartridge 23, Renovation Collection 1. This game was originally released as Sol-Feace on the Japanese Sharp X68000 in late 1990. About 1 year later, in late 1991, Sol-Feace received a port on the Sega Mega CD in Japan and was actually a pack-in title for the Sega CD when the console was released in North America in late 1992. It was also a pack-in title for the Mega CD in Europe when it was released in 1993. In between the releases of the Japanese Mega CD and the North American Sega CD versions, in early 1992, Sol-Feace received a port for the Sega Genesis in North America. It was pretty much the Sega CD version except stripped down to remove any of the enhancements the CD version offered. Also, the name was changed to Sol-Deace, and I could not find any particular reason for this name change. This version of the game was only released in North America, and it is the version of the game included in this Evercade collection. The game's story seems to vary in details from source to source, but at its core it's pretty straightforward. Around the year 3000, a supercomputer called the GCS-WT was created, and shortly after going online, it became self-aware and eventually began hunting down and enslaving the human race.
Something very familiar about all this.
On the distant planet Silius, scientist Dr. Edwin Deese has been working on a spacecraft, the Sol-Deace, with the specific goal of breaking through the defenses of the GCS-WT and taking it out once and for all. Just before the project was completed, though, Dr. Deese was killed as a result of the GCS-WT's galaxy-wide manhunt. All that remains is the pilot, Eric Williams, and his gunner, Masaya Hatanaka. So humanity's future rests on them to take the Sol-Deace and launch one last counterattack against the GCS-WT. Sol-Deace is a pretty basic, horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-up. One hit will destroy your ship, and when you lose all your lives, you can continue from the beginning of the last stage you were on. Well, except for stage 6. From there, you'll have to restart from stage 5. You can use 3 buttons on the controller, but they all do the same thing: provide auto-fire for your weapons. You can collect a very limited array of 4 different weapon power-ups during the gameplay. These power-ups can replace your main weapon, or provide additional firepower mounted above or below your spacecraft. The main gimmick of this game is that you can manually adjust the angle at which these additional weapons fire. When you stop firing, these weapons will change angles based on the movements of your ship. If you move forward, both weapons will angle outward. Move backwards and they will angle straight ahead. Moving up will angle one straight ahead and the other one outward, and moving down will do the opposite. When you are firing your weapons, they will lock in place. The game overall is pretty basic, but there's nothing really wrong with that, I feel. The gimmick of angling your weapons is a simple concept, but I feel like it's the only thing the game needs to keep things interesting. Although it would have been nice to have more than 4 weapon types to pick up. It is nice that the game will always provide a weapon power-up to pick up right after losing a life, so you aren't stuck in a tight spot with only one immovable gun. It was also surprising to find that your ship doesn't get destroyed by bumping into a wall or the environment. However, it will bounce around awkwardly, and if you keep repeatedly hitting the walls, it will destroy your ship. The biggest complaint I really have with the game is that I don't really know where the ship's hitbox is. The ship itself is a rather large target, and it doesn't really feel like the whole thing is the hitbox, but it would have been nice to know where those boundaries are, since you can wind up in some tight situations. So yeah, it's a pretty basic, slower paced shoot 'em up, but being able to angle the weapons is a pretty interesting gimmick.
Traysia!
Traysia is one of 12 games included in Evercade Cartridge 23, Renovation Collection 1. Traysia was developed for the Sega Mega Drive by Riot and released in Japan in early 1992 as Minato no Traysia, which roughly translates to Traysia of the port. Like, a place where ships dock to load and unload cargo. Renovation released Traysia for the Sega Genesis in North America late in 1992. This game was only ever released for the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive, and this is a standalone title with no prequels or sequels of any kind. I was very unfamiliar with Traysia, so I had no idea what the game's story was before I began. All I had to go on was the artwork on the game box, and I thought the game's plot would somehow involve fighting dragons in a land named Traysia. But that's not it at all. Looking at the Japanese box art tells a completely different story that's more accurate to the actual game. Before the game starts proper, we're given the premise via the game's intro, but further details are explained in the game's manual and even on the back of the box. Our protagonist, Roy, lives in the port town of Johanna, and despite the fact that he enjoys his life there, he has the urge to go out and travel to lands he's never seen before. His uncle is a traveling merchant, and when the opportunity arises, he decides to go along with his uncle. Before he leaves, he says goodbye to his girlfriend, Traysia, and promises to return one day. The game just then begins with Roy by himself in the Kingdom of Ceylon. And if you haven't read the manual, you might be thinking, where's his uncle? I thought they were traveling together. Initially, you may even think you're starting the game in Roy's hometown of Johanna because there's been no indication that Roy has gone anywhere, and you only find out he's somewhere else when you start talking to people. Well, the game's manual fills in the blanks that the game itself decided not to tell us. Roy does begin traveling with his uncle's caravan. However, when they reach the Kingdom of Ceylon, his uncle tells him that Roy can't continue with them anymore because the places they are going only allows merchants. He's like, see ya back in Johanna, Roy. To me, it sounds kind of weird that his uncle would know Roy can't really accompany them on their journey, but doesn't tell him before the journey starts. I wonder if it's some sort of translation issue and Roy knew the whole time he'd be leaving the caravan at some point. Anyway, the game's story is broken up into 5 different chapters, each with their own little sub-story and different towns to visit, but each sub-story does tie in with the game's main story about evil wizards and their attempts to conquer the world. The game itself is an RPG, and while it does play like most 16-bit RPGs from the time, there are some differences that really stick out. You'll mostly be playing with a party of the same 4 characters throughout the game, and each character will gain experience through battles and level up from time to time, increasing their stats. Each character can be equipped with armor, shields, weapons, magic, and accessories that can be purchased or found throughout the game to improve their stats. However, there is no shared inventory, and each character is limited to carrying 16 items, including their equipment. Visiting each town mostly consists of talking to villagers for information and visiting shops to buy and sell equipment. Hospitals and inns offer a way to heal the party completely, and the game can only be saved at the inns, although it hardly matters here since you're able to use save states with the Evercade. Traveling to and from locations are not done with an overworld map, but rather just through environmental maps that will offer random encounters with monsters and enemies, and it's the same while progressing through dungeons, which will usually offer up a boss or 2 before the chapter ends. The fighting is turn-based, however it's done via an overhead view, and characters must first be placed into position before they're able to attack. Commands for all characters will first be entered, and then all the attacks will play out, and this will continue until the battle is won or lost or fleed. However, if Roy dies in battle, it's an instant game over, and it doesn't even matter if all the other characters are perfectly fine. So I've got a lot of thoughts on this game, and it's mostly not positive. However, there are a couple things I did like about the game. I found that once the game gets started, the story is pretty straightforward for the most part, although it does offer some interesting twists here and there. The main villain of the game is interesting in his own right, from how he's revealed to how he's involved with each chapter of the game. One last positive thing about the game is that even though there are random encounters, they really don't happen that frequently. On occasion, I was even able to traverse a whole screen without a random encounter. But that's everything positive I can think of about this game. I've got a laundry list of issues with it. I'll start out by saying that even though the game's story was easy to follow, it's certainly not because of the game's visuals. And it's not like I'm saying the game looks bad, it's just that simple details are missing that would enhance the game immensely. The biggest example of this that comes to mind is that at one point of the game, you're talking to a town's mayor, and this dude comes running in saying, "Mayor, the magic school is burning!" And he's like, "Holy crap, we gotta check this out!" The screen fades out, and when it comes back in, he hasn't gone anywhere. But that's not why I'm bringing this up. You see, when you do go to check the magic school, it looks fine, like it always does. The guy that wanders around outside doesn't even act like there's a problem. So you go inside and talk to the first guy you see, and he's like, "Holy crap, there's a fire! This building is done for!" You're teleported back outside and the building is just obliterated. My question is, why couldn't they have shown some flames or something on the building to show it was on fire? Instead, we just have to pretend. It's okay though, because if you leave the screen using the staircase just above the school and then come back, the building is just instantly back to normal anyway. There's a lot of little oddities like this, and later in the video I'll talk about a couple that you can use to really take advantage of this game. Another thing that's kind of annoying has to do with the battles in the game. Like I mentioned, you first have to move the characters into position before they can attack. However, they will always take a specific path to where you need them to go, and if there's something blocking their way, they will just instantly stop. They won't even try to figure a way to get around. For example, you'd like your character to attack an enemy that happens to be really close by. and there's an open path to the enemy, the character decides that he's going to take a different route and attack from a different angle, but there happens to be somebody else standing in the way, well, he just will stop at that point, and it'll completely waste that character's turn. So instead, you're going to have to waste a turn manually moving them somewhere else before the next turn in which they can attack. That's just a really odd thing that you have to keep in mind, and it can account for a lot of wasted turns in a game, and overall it can be pretty annoying. Another thing I found annoying was navigating the menus because it's kind of easy to lose your place with what you're doing. It's complicated further by the fact that each character gets their own separate identical version of the same menu. Combine that with the fact that you can only buy one item at a time in stores, and it can take quite a long time to sell your old equipment and buy and equip the new equipment. And you simply can't skip the selling of your old equipment, even if you've got a lot of money, because each character can only carry 16 items, including mandatory items the game won't let you get rid of, making the selling and dropping of the old equipment necessary to make sure your characters have enough space in their inventory for the new equipment, which you then have to go into each character's separate menu and equip every item one at a time. Speaking of equipment, you'll need a separate guide just for that, because certain items can only be equipped to certain characters, but the game doesn't tell you who can be equipped with what. And this is probably the biggest issue I have with this game: the lack of information the game provides about what you're buying or picking up. Even the game's original manual doesn't really tell you anything other than what type of weapons each character can wield, and then it only half-heartedly lists only some of the sword-type weapons in the game. And they really didn't even care about doing that. I mean, that's why among the list you'll find the broadsword, and also the river sword, which doesn't even exist in the game. They probably meant the ripper sword. And what in the hell is Shamsha supposed to be? The game just assumes that you'll know based on its name what type of weapon it is. But do a lot of people know that a salamander is a type of crossbow? Figuring out who can equip what armors and shields is even worse, and without any type of guide, the only way to know is to buy the item and see who the game lets you equip it to. But this is only half the issue with the equipment. The game or the manual also never tells you the stats of the equipment, nor does it say if it's better or worse than what you've already got equipped. The only way to know without a guide is to navigate to your character's stat page, make a note of the values, swap out the equipment, and recheck the stat page to see if they've improved or not. It's not just the equipment though either. The game doesn't tell you what any of the items do, even after you use them. If it's an item that heals you, you would just have to notice that your health went up when you used it. The same goes for magic. Not only does it not tell you what each of the spells do, it doesn't even tell you how many magic points are necessary to perform the spell. From my playthrough experience though, magic sucks anyway. Every magic attack I tried either missed or did far weaker damage than if I just physically attacked. Hell, I don't even think I ran across any enemies that used magic attacks on me either. They know it sucks too. I could probably keep going on and on and on like this, but I'm pretty sure all the annoyances and oddities I had with this game aren't as big as the ones I've just mentioned. Although the game story is okay overall, the way the game is designed is very confusing and it doesn't relay important information to you. It almost ensures that you'll need to acquire a strategy guide just to figure out things like what any of the items in the game do. And there were certain items I never figured out if they had a purpose or not, even with the strategy guide.
Valis.
Valis is one of 12 games included in Evercade cartridge 23, Renovation Collection 1. This game was originally released for the NEC PC-88 back in 1986, where it was known as Mugen Senshi Valis, or Valis, the Phantasm Soldier. The game was ported to many platforms, and even though the story remains mostly consistent between these releases, some ports of the game would completely rework the gameplay to the point to where it can be considered a remake or a remaster. The game would also receive ports in 1986 for the MSX and Sharp X1, and in 1987 for the NEC PC-98, the Fujitsu FM7, and the Nintendo Famicom. The Famicom version was the first version to greatly change the way the game played from the original, as this is the only version of the game to feature maze-like maps. Next to be released is the Sega Mega Drive/Genesis version in 1991, and this could be considered to be a remaster of the original version of the game as it vastly improves the graphics, gameplay, and level design. This is the only version of the game to get a release in North America, where it was titled simply Valis. This is the version of the game that's included in the Renovation Collection 1 for the Evercade. There was then a release in 1992 for the NEC PC Engine CD, and this further builds upon the Genesis version with even more refined gameplay, upgraded graphics and animation, fully voiced cutscenes, and of course CD quality music. The last version of the game was released in 2005 for the Vodafone. However, since this was a digital-only title for a Japanese mobile phone, it is very difficult to play these days, as well as to even see decent footage of it. Valis, the Phantasm Soldier, spawned 3 sequels released on a variety of platforms, as well as a few auxiliary titles and collections. The story begins as teenager Yuko is leaving school. She notes that the weather has been rather strange lately, as she gets caught in the rain and stands under an awning waiting for it to stop. Just as it stops, her classmate Raiko approaches and talks to Yuko and leaves some cryptic comments before taking off in a direction opposite from where she lives. Shortly thereafter, Yuko is attacked by a monster, but a sword appears in her hand, and that's the point at which the game starts. In the first level, Yuko runs through the streets destroying monsters in her path, and eventually encounters and defeats Gaida, the leader of this particular invasion force. We are then filled in with the rest of the story via cutscene. Yuko is summoned to the Dream World, ruled by Queen Valia, who explains that humans are influenced by both the Dream World and the Dark World, creating a yin and yang effect on the human world. However, since the king of the Dark World, Rogueless, has been invading the Dream World with the intent to take over, the yin and yang in the human world has been thrown out of whack, causing the darkness in humans to start taking over. The sword that appeared in Yuko's hand is the Sword of Valis, and it chose Yuko because she had the perfect balance of yin and yang, making her potentially the most powerful warrior. Although initially reluctant to fight, Valia is eventually able to convince Yuko to fight Rogueless's generals, collecting the Phantasm jewels that they carry, and then confront Rogueless himself. The game itself is a hack-and-slash platformer where Yuko has a few basic actions that she can perform. She has a standard jump, but holding up while jumping will cause her to jump higher. There's a slide button, which is actually used for something that you wouldn't initially think of. Occasionally you'll run across these gaps in the ground you'll need to cross, but if the ceiling's too low to jump over the gap, well, you can just slide over it. I mean, it's kind of weird, but it works. And of course, you've got your attack button to swing your sword. Throughout the game, you'll encounter 5 different sword icons, and these will change the effect of swinging your sword. You've got bullets, laser, homing arrows, cutter waves, and short-range explosive grenades. If you collect another sword effect item that is the same one that you currently have, the attack is upgraded. Each attack effect has 3 levels. Every time Yuko defeats a general and collects a Phantasm jewel, she also gains the magical ability of the general that was just defeated, kinda like a Mega Man game. Pressing start to pause game will allow you to select which magic you want to use, and pressing up and attack will use the selected magic in the game. Using magic will consume magic points, so you'll only be able to perform the ability if there's enough magic points to use it. And of course, every magical ability consumes a different amount of points, and pretty much the magic that you can get later in the game will be more powerful and use up more magic points. Oddly enough, when you beat a level or lose a life, all of your health points will be restored, but your magic points won't be. The only way to restore your magic points is to collect an item that will replenish them from item boxes. Also, when losing a life, your sword level will be taken down a level as well. Even with all this taken into account, this is one of the easier versions of Valis since your health meter will last quite a long time, and even when you get a game over, you're allowed an infinite amount of continues. Although if you do continue, you'll have absolutely no weapon effect. But there's usually one to acquire at the start of each level anyway. Personally, I really enjoyed this title. I found it fun to experiment with the different weapon types, and although some of the levels are a bit maze-like and some paths lead to dead ends, there was always something to collect before you needed to turn around. I also thought it was nice that defeated monsters do not respawn, so if you need to turn around or backtrack through a portion of a level, it's a clear path if you've already defeated the monsters in that area. I wish though that Yuko could run just a little bit faster throughout the levels, but more importantly, I wish that the controls were just a little bit more responsive. There were times that I wanted to turn around and attack, but Yuko wouldn't turn around before attacking. I presume this was because she was still in an animation from a previous action, but as a result it makes the controls feel a little bit sluggish. Also, it can be a little bit difficult to tell if you're hitting an enemy or not, especially if you have a weak weapon. Also, it's a little bit annoying that your magical abilities is used pressing up and the attack button, because it can interfere with your ability to press up and jump to jump higher, because sometimes you'll want to jump higher and attack, but if you happen to be on the ground, you'll accidentally use your magic instead. I think this whole issue could have been resolved if you could just jump higher to begin with, or maybe even double jump, then it wouldn't interfere with your ability to push up and attack for your magic ability. Still, with all that, it's not something I found overly frustrating, primarily because the game is very generous with your health, and there aren't a whole lot of instant death pits to fall into. It was also kind of cool to see those extended cutscenes playing out in a Genesis title though, and it was also nice that you could skip them if you wanted to. I really liked Valis, however, sluggish controls and questionable hitboxes mean that I have to knock it down a little bit from where I'd like to put it. Valis III! Valis III is one of 12 games included in Evercade Cartridge 23, Renovation Collection 1. Valis III is the third of 4 games in the main Valis series, and while Valis 1 and 2 originated on the NEC PC-88 and was ported to several platforms afterward, Valis III had its origins on the NEC PC Engine CD, and afterwards received a downgraded port to the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive. And when I say downgraded, I'm not just talking about the removal of CD audio and animated cutscenes. Good chunks of the levels were removed as well. The North American Sega Genesis version of the game is what's included in Renovation Collection 1. About a year after Valis III received the North American release on the Sega Genesis, the game was brought over to the TurboGrafx CD in North America. So technically, even though the PC Engine CD version is the original, North America didn't receive it until after the Sega Genesis version. The game's intro starts out by recapping the events of Valis 1 and 2, which is good because the game was released before Valis 1 for the Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx CD. And although Valis 2 did receive a release in North America for the TurboGrafx CD, there was no North American release for the Sega Genesis, unless you count Sid of Valis, which is an altered version of Valis 2, but that wasn't released until the following year. Anyway, the important bits of the story from the previous titles is that Rogueless from the Dark World had invaded the Dream World, and Queen Valia had sent the Valis sword to Yuko and summoned her from the human world to help defeat Rogueless, which she succeeds in accomplishing. And then the Megas army from the Dark World invaded the Dream World, and Yuko returns to help defend it, but before she is successful, she's unable to prevent the death of Queen Valia. However, from Valia's will, she learns that Princess Valna is her sister, meaning that Queen Valia had been her mother all along. The backstory doesn't explain why Yuko didn't know this or why she had been living on Earth. Well, maybe you just have to play Valis 2 to figure that out. As Valis 3 begins, we learn that the Dark World hasn't been invading the other worlds just because they're evil, but rather it's because the Dark World is facing total destruction as it will soon be absorbed into the Netherworld. Thus, these invasions have been because the residents of the Dark World will need to find a new home or else be destroyed. The next and final invasion is being planned by Glamis, the king of the Dark World who possesses the Lethus sword, the counterpart to the Valis sword. Not all residents of the Dark World are in favor of the invasion, and a baron by the name of Lada is one of those who voiced opposition, but was killed by Glamis because of his stance. His daughter Cham is now out for revenge and hatches a plan to steal the Valis sword from Yuko to help with that task. She manages to steal the sword, but Yuko follows in hot pursuit, only to witness Cham being captured by one of Glamis' minions. Cham releases the sword, allowing Yuko to take possession once again, transform, and begin the game. The game plays very much like Valis 1, which is also on this collection, and it makes sense because Valis 3 was actually released before Valis 1 on both the TurboGrafx CD and Sega Genesis. Valis 1 on these platforms can be considered to be a remake or a remaster because the gameplay wasn't recreated from the original games, but rather it was based on the same type of gameplay from Valis 3. So it's pretty much the same controls as Valis 1, which I've already made a video for. You've got a regular jump, and by pressing up you can jump even higher. There's a regular attack button, and by pressing up while pressing the attack button you'll perform a magic attack. The dedicated slide button is here as well, though some levels are designed to where you'll actually need to use it. There are some pretty big differences though, such as the fact that there's no longer the ability to change attack types for your sword by picking up icons that were on the screen. There is a meter at the top of the screen that indicates the strength of your attack, and when you attack, the meter empties and immediately starts to refill. Power-ups can be acquired to extend the length of the attack meter, as well as speeding up the rate in which it charges. There are only 3 magic types in the game, Flame, Ice, and Thunder, and they are selected by item pickups this time around. The main reason there's seemingly less ways to attack, however, is because you can now switch between 3 characters as you play by holding down the slide button. Each character has different main attacks, but will also have different magic attacks for each magic type. There's Yuko with strong attacks but weak magic, Valna, Yuko's sister, who has weak attacks but strong magic, and Cham, of whom I'm pretty sure is the balanced character. All 3 characters share the same health and magic meters, but sometimes a character will not be available to use for some portions of the game. For example, you won't be able to use Valna until you free her, and then for a short time after that, you're forced to play as her. For most of the game, however, it's up to you to decide which character is best to use for each part of the game. Since the game's controls are very similar to Valis, which I've already talked about, I've got the same issue with the controls sometimes feeling a little bit unresponsive at times, and I still kind of wish that jumping high was just standard or done with a double jump instead of having to hold up and jump. But I suppose the controls are acceptable the way they are. I mean, I've certainly played far worse. The game itself felt a little bit more difficult than Valis 1, but that just may be down to not using the best characters for some situations. And the ability to switch characters is something I really like about this game, because it really gives you a reason to go back and play it again just to see how each character handles in each level they are playable in. When I first played through the game, I played most of the game as Yuko, and while the bosses remain fun to fight, some of them seem to take quite a while to beat, and afterwards I was thinking if they might have been easier if I was playing as a different character. Either that or there's some sliding technique I wasn't quite grasping. The game's original manual kept mentioning that you were invincible while you were sliding, but as I was playing that didn't seem to be the case, unless there was something I was misunderstanding. Regardless though, there was one level in particular that I felt took the difficulty just a little bit too far, in that it kept requiring you to slide under spikes while on a moving platform with nothing to land on nearby after you slide off the platform. It took me a good number of tries to get past that part. So ultimately, I enjoyed playing Valis 3. I mean, it's not my favorite game in the collection, but I did like it better than Valis 1, and it's primarily due to the ability to switch characters. But there also seemed to be a bit more to the cutscenes and presentation as well. Hey there, enough of that old footage. Let's rank the games in the Renovation collection using the new system I have here. So, my least favorite game was, in fact, Beast Wrestler. I'm going to put this on the level bad. I don't know why I didn't put it on frustrating, because it is kind of frustrating, but I don't think it... Maybe it's not that frustrating. I just think this is a flat-out bad game, so I'm going to put that on level bad. Next up, I'm going to put... Where is it? Traysia! I'm going to put this on the not-for-me level. Maybe some people like this game. I think this is widely regarded as not a good RPG. I don't know how, if you played it way back in the day when it was originally released, I don't know how you would feel about it now, but maybe I should put this down on bad, but I'm going to put this on not for me, because I don't think it's actually bad. I think it's broken. Anyway, just being broken doesn't necessarily make it bad. Maybe it does. I don't know. I'm putting it on not for me because I didn't like it. Next up, I'm going to put Dino Land. I'm going to put this on... Oh, I'm going to say this is okay. We're skipping indifferent. It's just okay. You'd think that since this was a pinball game, I'd have it a lot higher up on my list. I just don't think it's that great of a pinball game. It's and the fact that the game has an ending, but you have to play the game for like 4 hours straight in order to reach it, kind of ridiculous, and it kind of defeats the purpose of a pinball machine. It's going for a high score. And when you lose all your balls, you could just continue with the score you previously had. It makes no sense. But again, it's not, I don't think I hate it. I think I do kind of like it. That's why it's on okay. And next up, I'm going to put Exile. Again, it's another action RPG. Just don't think it's fantastic, but I, again, think it's just okay. Next, we've got Final Zone. I know a lot of people really like this game. Again, I like it, but not a whole lot. The whole problem, like with the not really seeing the whole map or where the enemies are and everything. I had a comment that somebody said, you know, the maps are pretty small, so you don't really need a map. But, you know, even though the map is small, the fact that you can't see everything and you're hunting for something, you're moving, they're moving, it could be a while before you guys meet up, you know? Anyway, I could say it's just okay. I'm not going to say I don't like it, but I will say I do like it just a little bit. Next, I'm going to put Arcus Odyssey, and I thought this was a good game. Top isometric shoot-em-up type of game. I think this was the first one I played, because back then I played these games alphabetically, and I think Arcus Odyssey was the first game. So, yeah, certainly not bad. Good, in fact, which is why I put it on good. Next, we're going to put Sol-Deace, and I'm going to say this is a pretty great game. Not overly complicated, just pretty straightforward. The gimmick being you can rotate the turrets on the edges of the ship, so not bad there if you want a pretty straight shoot 'em up. Next, also on the great level, Granada. This game I actually wound up liking this game a lot more than I thought I would. I thought the game was going to be a lot shorter than it actually was too. I remember thinking, oh, this must be the last level, and then the game would just keep continuing and continuing. It's like, wait a minute, how many levels are there? But, you know, your tank, you've got a lot of maneuverability. It's pretty cool. I mean, the only thing that would have made it better is if it was a twin-stick shooter, but, you know, the fact that this was designed for the Genesis, that wasn't going to happen. Next, we've got Valis, the first Valis. I'm going to say this was fantastic. Once I really got into it, the whole story and the gameplay, yeah, there's nothing other than fantastic. It has a few quirks here and there, and that prevents it from being perfect, but yeah, fantastic. Next, Valis III, of course. It's very similar. In this one, you get to switch between 3 characters, but it's got pretty much the same quirks as the original Valis, but it does have a great story, and it's really cool to play. So yeah, I'm going to say fantastic. Next, Viento. This was a game I was looking forward to playing for a long time, and finally on the Evercade, I finally got my chance to play it. Not that I didn't have a chance to play it before through emulation, I just never really thought about it. But playing through the game, it was just super fast-paced and action-orientated, and I just really enjoyed this one. It's just that the final levels of the game can get kind of ridiculous with the maze-like levels and just the swarms of enemies coming right at you. So yeah, we're gonna leave that at fantastic, and looks like finally Gaiares, as it's properly called, Gaiares. Is it perfect? I'm going to say no. I'm still going to say it's fantastic, and it is my #1 game in Renovation Collection 1. Pretty cool shoot 'em up with the gimmick where you can steal the weapons from other craft, your enemy craft. So yeah, very creative, and you know, just really cool, all the boss characters that are in this game. All right, as for the ranking of Renovation Collection 1, in among all the rest of the collections, I've already had it in the ranking. I've kind of pulled it out and I'm holding it here. I guess, can I put it back here? Oh, I can. Okay. It's kind of giving away where I have placed this, because you can see that tier 2 has missing one. So obviously it's somewhere in tier 2. And when I put together the points based on the scores or the grades I gave the games, it's going to wind up right above Intellivision Collection 1, right above, right at the top of tier 2, and right below Atari Lynx Collection 1. So that is where Renovation Collection 1 currently sits in my rankings of all the Evercade cartridges I've done up until this point. And the point in time that I'm currently at is I just ranked the C64 Collection 1, and I need to move on to Owl's Awakening and Cathedral. But I just wanted to put this video together so all of the Renovation Collection games that I talk about are all in one video, no matter how long it was. And I wonder how many people actually watched this whole thing, especially since most of it was just ripped from other videos that I made. But I wanted to take those 13 videos and turn it into just one video. So I've done that. So I'm going to be moving on from here. Thanks for watching. See you next time.